Welcome to another edition of the Hawk Off the Press podcast. I'm your host, Gazette Hawkeyes reporter, John Steppe. Excited to welcome back a familiar guest, Scott Dochterman from The Athletic, especially familiar with this podcast from its previous name. Scott, thanks for joining me again.
John, it's good to be with you. Yeah, I have many fond memories of the On Iowa podcast back in the day. So always happy to be a part of the Gazette's podcast network.
Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit of NFL Combine. 2 weeks since then, 2 weeks until Iowa's Pro Day, kind of the next landmark for these NFL draft prospects from Iowa. I guess before we get into individual players from the Combine, probably good to preface it with this is one data point in the pre-draft process, and what people are seeing in terms of these numbers with the drills is also just one aspect of what's getting evaluated in Indianapolis.
I always look at it as, and from what I've been told over the years, is the Combine is more of a confirmation for most of these teams. It's not, they really don't look at this. There are positions where it really matters, and there are positions where you're just kind of like checking a box. And, corner, receiver, a lot of times that's more where you really get into the 40 time and the 10-yard splits and some of those things, explosive numbers in the jumps, those are things that really matter. And I think off the edge, that's another one where you really get into it. But then there are other positions, and I would say the ones that the Iowa players in particular were a part of, where it doesn't matter that much. So it ultimately, it's about what they do on the tape. Because if you can't play, you're not going to be there. And then, a lot of times you want your numbers to be close to what you did on the tape. So, just to throw out an example, like Sebastian Castro ran a sub 4.6. That's pretty good, even though in his group he was slow comparatively. But his numbers suggest he's a pretty good player for that number. Whereas if he would have ran a sub 4.4, people might have been asking, well, why don't you play that fast on tape? Or, or if you ran a 4.9, it's like, well, wait a minute, timeout. But when you run close to what they think you should run, then it just kind of is a check the box. So, yeah, it's one data point, as you said, but it is out of a checklist of 50. It's not in the top 5 for sure.
And so many of the things at the Combine, too, seem to be the team meetings that happen, obviously, very privately, that we don't really hear all that much about, oftentimes until after they actually draft them. And then we hear kind of details of that, or even sometimes more than that.
Yeah, it's, the informal and formal meetings are really important. That's after medical. Medical is number one for the teams and for the players, too, to make sure that, okay, this player is capable of competing. After that, the meetings are the most important thing, more so than the Underwear Olympics part of it. And that is, you've got to be able to, they want you to come in and describe what you see, what you're doing, how you can compete. And you make an impression on these coaches and the general managers and scouts and everybody in the room in a very short period of time. I mean, quarterback, it's the most important. It's probably more important than medical in some cases. But for other ones, an interesting thing was, talking to both Caleb Johnson and Liddell Betts, because I, had a beverage with him for a little while one of the days. And it was really kind of funny and somewhat awkward that the Giants brought in Caleb Johnson for a formal meeting, and he's the one conducting it. So they're going over tape that they'd already been over before, but they're doing it for a different audience. So it's kind of funny how that all works out. But definitely the meetings are pivotal in how, and a lot of it is, let's take Y.A. Black in this situation. He's a 2-gap defensive tackle who doesn't have a lot of stats. His testing numbers were not great. However, he is a very articulate man when it comes to describing what he does and how he performs. And he can describe it in detail. I take a lateral first step off the line of scrimmage. My goal is to get to this gap. Usually I'm double teamed. I stonewall the gap. It enables Jay Higgins to make the tackle. And I'm very much going cliff notes on that. But if he can describe that on video and it measures up to what the officials see, Not that, oh, yeah, I was trying to do this and it didn't work. Then that's a win for him, and I think that's the important part of the whole combine experience.
So let's start off with Caleb Johnson. In terms of his 40 time, 4.57, not the greatest out of running backs, but it seems like that's one of those cases where the on-field production was as impressive as it was. And that probably, I don't think he maybe did himself any favors with that 40 time, but you still have that on-field production that should help him heading into April.
Yeah, it's an okay number. I mean, it's not a great number, as you said. I mean, there are a lot of, and this is a running back heavy draft. That he was never going to be number one, even if he ran a 4.2. So Ashton Jeanty is that guy, Genty. But then after that, he's in that next category, depending on what you're looking for in a running back, with Omarion Hampton, Cam Scattaboo, the two Ohio State guys, Dylan Sampson. There are a lot of really good running backs. I would say there's 6, 7, 8 who are capable of starting at the next level. And he's definitely in that category. And his 40 time and probably his 10-yard was just not great, but again, is it what we see on tape? And it pretty much is. He's not an elusive quick back. He's physical, and then he has tremendous breakaway speed, and those are the things that people will see. And that does translate. And to get, again, under a 4.6, 4.57, and he'll have an opportunity at pro day to improve upon that, which I think he would probably want to try to, because I think the expectation was he was going to run sub 4.5. So maybe like 4.49, 4.48, something like that. So to get above a 4.5 is something he's probably disappointed in. I'm sure he'll do something there, but largely it's not a number that makes people go, oh, well, I can't draft that guy then. I mean, you've already seen it. You already could tell his style and what he's capable of. So I thought he did okay.
And then we were talking a little bit about Castro before, somebody that didn't have the fastest numbers, agility wise, not great either. But it seems like this is another guy where, okay, you still have a pretty substantial body of work in terms of what he can do kind of at safety or slot corner.
Yeah. And he's, in Iowa, as we know, he's played multiple positions. He's played strong safety. He's played cash, which cash is like this tripod of responsibilities. It's you've got, you're kind of a Sam linebacker, you're kind of a slot corner, you're kind of a nickel, you're in run support, you're in pass protection, you're one-on-one. You do all these different things. I think for him at the next level, what this kind of confirmed is, okay, he's a straight safety. And but with that, yeah, his numbers weren't great comparatively to a lot of elite players or at that position. However, then you take it to the tape and you see the way he performs, his explosiveness, his tackling ability, his ability to be in the right spot at the right time. How do you narrow that responsibility? Whereas Iowa had a very expansive responsibility. I'm sure that's going to be fine. He probably solidified that he's a third rounder. I think there might have been, had he ran a 4.48 or something like that, a full 100th of a second or 10th of a second off. If he would have ran that high, then there probably would have been more expansive talk of, well, maybe he can do this and this and this. I think this kind of narrows it. And the other thing is, when you get safeties who've been in the league 4 or 5 years, they're all running this time. So Castro's played played well enough, shown enough that I expect him to probably still be about a third round guy, maybe early fourth. And he, at worst case scenario, you've got a sub package guy who excels on special teams. And that's not something that teams take for granted.
Especially in how much of a sub-package league it seems to be currently in the NFL.
Yeah.
At tight end then with Luke Lachey, no 40 time for him. I would have been curious to see what that number would have been. In terms of his other things, it seemed like most of the 20-yard shuttle is probably one that Luke would like to have back, but the other numbers didn't seem to necessarily hurt his case in Indianapolis.
Yeah, I mean, jumping 35, and broad jumping 10, that shows good explosiveness. With him, it's going to be about tape, and I think it's going to be more of a projection than it is body of work with him, as we know, John. He got hurt 2 years ago, broke his legs. It was a gross injury, and he was out. Comes back and stood out as a blocker at the East-West Shrine Bowl. That was established. But then then you look at pass catching numbers were not good. Now, some of it was, how is he refined as a route runner? And I think he's got work to do there. But then other parts are, Iowa's quarterback situation had very much an impact on that. So it's going to be more about projection. I think what people look at is, okay, athletically, he's there. He's got the size. He can block. He has shown before that he's capable of catching passes. He's not a starter day one, like maybe a Sam Laporta was or TJ Hawkinson was or anybody like that. But he's a guy that we feel like we could put in there in sub packages, 12 personnel, certainly special teams. And, but year 2 or 3, he might be in that category. So there's some really good tight ends. He's probably at best 6th out of this list. But, in year 3 or 4, he might be a starter, and that's something that teams look at. And again, and this is where Iowa's reputation at that position group matters, because I think the top 2 to me are, you just don't even challenge it. I think Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland are elite level players who perform that way in the Big Ten. But like Harold Fannin, outstanding pass catcher, marginal to below average as a blocker. And okay, you can situationally line him up. Travis Kelce's in somewhat that category, although he's a decent blocker. But Kyle Pitts was that way too at Florida, and then he went to Atlanta, and he's been nothing short of a disappointment. So you're not, what you're gonna get and at a baseline, and I think that's why teams are going to look at him and say, my guess is probably 3rd to 4th round, maybe 5th at the worst for him, just because they know that they're going to, at minimum, get a pretty willing and solid blocker that's a capable pass catcher that's got some work to do, but he's coming off a pretty significant injury from the year before and a not so good passing offense.
Yeah, like to your point, it kind of feels when we talk about Luke Lachey as an NFL draft prospect, it's the what if prospect of, okay, what if he doesn't have that week 3 injury against Western Michigan, I think it was. What if he doesn't have that? What if Iowa has somewhat competent passing, in terms of just who's getting him the ball? I think you would have thought that the Cade McNamara experiment would have gone better, and that could be a whole nother podcast right there. But that affects your tight ends draft prospects. But if there's a silver lining, to your point, reputationally with Iowa, you even look at a guy like Eric Hall. Obviously, injuries kind of got in the way there, but had it not been for the injuries in Cincinnati, that seemed to be a positive development in terms of an Iowa tight end that went in the 4th round, despite not necessarily having the most production and having some question marks, notably with injuries. So you look at it and, okay, if Eric Hall was able to do what he did until injuries again, that doesn't hurt Luke Lachey.
Of course. And, people will look at how did he play alongside Sam Laporta, whose numbers his final year were not great. I think he only had 1 touchdown catch. I think Lachey had like 4 that year. So the potential's there, and he's shown what he's capable of doing. He's shown that he's an NFL caliber tight end. I think there's a projection there, but there's a baseline, and I always say this when you start to talk about Iowa players versus the field when it comes, especially late round guys. And I don't think Luke's a late round guy. There are some in this one. And that is people oftentimes I've had scouts or GMs or whatever tell me that when you get an Iowa guy, you generally it's like getting a second year player because they're so well coached. That works 90% of the time. It works well for them. The 10% it doesn't is when teams say, well, they've already reached their plateau, that we already know what they are, and because we want to be able to coach them and make them better. And in some cases, they're not going to get much better. It's just going to be, unlike some players who didn't reach their potential, they were poorly coached or they just weren't in a great system. And then all of a sudden they go to the next level, and then you have a chance to make that jump. And it's like, wow, where did this guy come from? And then the other side of it is, and I look at a guy who didn't get invited, and I thought Mason Richman should have been invited. 16 out of 32 teams invited him. You need 18 to get to the combine. It's just stupid, but it's the way it worked. In his case, you get in the 6th, 7th round, you've got a couple lines of thought here. If you're let's throw out like Philadelphia Eagles, and I don't know what their late round draft situation is, but let's say you feel like you've got 6 spots on your roster that are open. The rest of it's pretty much determined already going into camp. And you're in the 6th round and you've already drafted 4, 5, 6 other guys that you feel like are going to make your roster. You're not going to draft a Mason Richman because he's not going to make your roster. You're going to take a big swing at somebody who's been injured, somebody who maybe has character concerns, somebody who's off the charts athletically and didn't pan out, because you want to see, okay, we can either hit a home run, but if we strike out, who cares? Get them out of there. It doesn't matter. But then there are teams that are, say, salary cap strapped. They have no money. They have a lot of holes. They, especially on something like the offensive line, where it's like, we just need somebody who can play. Then you'll take that safe choice, whether it's Mason Richman type, in the 6th or 7th round. It's like, we just need somebody who can step in and play, and not, we can't have this wide variance of maybe he's a home run, but maybe he's a strikeout. We just need somebody who can get on base. And that's, and I'm sorry to mix analogies with baseball and football, but it's true. And that's kind of where they are right now. And that's where Iowa guys fit in really well. That, he didn't get drafted for a couple of reasons, but Alaric Jackson was that type of guy. When he went undrafted, it worked out beautifully for him, because the Los Angeles Rams were in salary cap hell. They didn't draft a offensive lineman. They only had like 5 or 6 on their roster. And so they needed somebody who could come in and play right away. And it worked out beautifully for both sides. He ends up starting at left tackle and now parlays that into a major extension. But it doesn't always work out that way. So I think, kind of my point with some of these guys is when it gets to the end, for Iowa guys, Luke Lachey, whatever, certainly Sebastian Castro, I think Y.A. Black will fit in this category, that they know what they've got and they're good with it. And maybe you're not going to get a Pro Bowler, maybe not even a starter, but you got somebody who's going to be on your roster and contributing in a positive way. And that says a lot for the program, and it says a lot for them.
Yeah, and 1,000% agree on Mason Richman. For him to not get invited was the biggest takeaway for me when I first saw that list. Was, okay, first of all, impressive that Iowa has 7 guys invited, but no Richman after he was a 4-year starter at left tackle and did a pretty good job too, especially this last year. But kind of continuing on offensive line, Connor Colby, I thought the Cedar Rapids product had a pretty respectable showing in Indianapolis, and looks like he has a pretty good path in terms of being, I think off the top of my head, it'd be the 20th offensive lineman drafted in the Ferentz era.
Yeah, he's going to get drafted. He did all right. I thought, his 40 time was really good for him, 5.11 as an interior offensive lineman. He had a Rocky type start to his career, to his career. I mean, first of all, he got thrown out there as a true freshman, which I wouldn't have, which is really tough on him to do that. And then to move to right tackle, which is, they thought of him when they recruited him, and he was probably going to be an outside, perimeter, blocker, and didn't work out, and then he moved inside, and by last year he performed really, really well. And, if you think about it, John, if in a normal year, normal trajectory, had some of the prospects from the late teens worked out so he could have redshirted, would he have come out in the draft this year? I would have said no. I would have thought he would have come back. And after a year that he had last year, he could have taken that really big step, I think, this year coming up. But he's a solid prospect. He absolutely is. He's probably in the fifth round range is probably where I would gauge him. And, a probable starter, maybe not a year one starter. It might take him a little bit of time, but certainly, a rotational guy, a guy who's like first interior guy. And he told me, I had a chance to kind of talk to him on the side and there too. And, they're working him out at center, he's working with snaps and stuff. And that's all to make sure that he's as versatile as he can be, because you want to be versatile. And I don't know if he end up there. See, honestly, I think Mason Richmond would make a great center. I think that would be his position personally. But I think Connor, if he can show that he can do that, and maybe by year two, you have that flexibility, then that adds something to him. And again, it might take him a little bit of time, but overall, I thought he had a really nice combine, and he's really matured. And it was fun to see him, because sometimes players, I've gotten this experience over the years that sometimes players, when they see, me and, whatever, that they get kind of like, oh, wow, somebody that they know, a recognizable face. And he was probably the most excited I've seen over the years from players there who, oh, right. I see somebody I like, Luke was that way too. So yeah, that was kind of fun.
Then kind of switching back to defensive, with Y.A. Black, we kind of talked about, okay, maybe not the greatest measurable or greatest drills. I think fantastic measurables. And as you mentioned, fantastic in interview portion when, you get him to break down a play kind of thing. Also defensively, Jay Higgins, I think that was maybe a surprising number for a lot of Iowa fans seeing this, but there are a lot of factors that can go into why Higgins maybe didn't have the best combine performance there.
I had a chance to pull Jay aside and talk to him for a little while about it, and his rationale with running the 40 there, because he had to do a lot of PT after the season to rehab his hamstring to put it in a position of this. And I said, I'm surprised you're going to run the 40. He goes, well, my agents told me that, you're going to get some adrenaline running there, and you might as well put something down so you know what to shoot for in your pro day. Otherwise, you only get one crack at it. And so if he cuts that down to a 4.7 at his pro day, then okay, he's, in better shape. And it's like, I was still coming off my hamstring, and teams respect that. So I think, his overall 40 numbers weren't awesome by any stretch. I mean, but a 4.82 was the same number that Josie Jewell ran there. I would say completely different people, but comparable players and how they performed. And I don't. It may knock him down a little bit, sure. But then you look at like his 3-cone, his agility, and he's number one in that area. That also shows that in short areas, he's able to laterally and vertically move quick enough to get to where he needs to go. And then you look at the tape, and the tape is just phenomenal. So I expect him to do a little bit better at the pro day, depending on what areas he wants to run. But Jay. I mean, he's gonna. I guess some testing he maybe didn't do as well as he could have, but I would expect that any meeting, anytime anybody gets to meet Jay Higgins, they're going to come away feeling pretty good about him. And I think he's going to be just fine. Now, YA, as you said, very articulate young man, huge, no real body fat, and it may be a situation where they're going to say, well, why we want you to bulk up even more, because he's only 340 pounds, and but speed's not there. That's okay, but if they ask. And this comes down to scheme too. If you want an interior pass rusher, he's not your guy. If you want somebody who's in there to clog up blockers and allow your backers to make plays, collapse the pocket so other players can get to the quarterback, he's the type of player you want. At worst case scenario, he's a rotational defensive tackle, and in this league, you need as many as you can get because players get hurt. It's as physical as you ever get. So I think YA is he's probably a later round guy just based on his numbers, but somebody's going to come away with at least a player who's going to play a lot for him.
And I think the thing for people to keep in mind too, when they're maybe comparing some of those drill numbers to other defensive tackles is, okay, he was at, I think 336 at the combine, and okay, naturally a 336 pound defensive tackle is not going to run as fast as say a 290 pound defensive tackle. So there is a certain element of apples and oranges schematically kind of within those numbers.
Yeah, you're not getting Aaron Donald. You're not getting 280, 285 bursting through the gap. One, just penetrate, and disrupt immediately. He's not that type of player. And what he is you throw him on nose, you throw him on a 0 or 1 technique, take up the blockers, tie up line of scrimmage, and that's your guy. He's not going to get a lot of stats, but that's okay. You don't need that all the time. So I think in his case, he's going to be fine. And again, in 336, man, he could have played offensive line. There was some really heavy internal discussion, not a year to 2 years ago, about maybe making him an offensive tackle, but he really wanted to stick to defense. And I think either way, he could have made it this far. But I think he's he's certainly a candidate to have a really, an impactful career. Just, maybe he only gets 20 tackles during the season, kind of like in Iowa, but he does exactly what the team scheme him to do, and then that's what he does best.
And then maybe one of the more intriguing prospects from Iowa this year, Jamari Harris. You look at his numbers, especially his PFF numbers in terms of receptions allowed versus targets. It's a pretty good year in a lot of regards for him. He doesn't play in those last 2 games. Sounds like you were able to get some time with him. Kind of what did you take away from kind of your discussion with him about kind of how his season ended?
It was interesting, obviously, because that was, that was a major focus, especially what happened at the end of the season where he decided to opt out of the final 2 regular season games to get what he felt he needed to get corrected. He had a previous surgery and he wanted to get a screw or something taken out, and it was bothering him. He said that everything worked out, that he did it, and everybody was okay with it. That's not necessarily the case. What it came down to, and I talked to a lot of GMs, not about him specifically, they're not going to talk about him, but about situations like that where players are opting out during the regular season, during bowl games, in Cam Ward's case, that they, how do they view it? And they all, most of them were like, we view it case by case. And so we're not going to just settle on we're not going to just say, oh, we'll never take him, or we'll take them all. I mean, they do want to investigate. And I asked, Jamari about it, and he said, yeah, that was like the first question. Everybody asked me about it and why I did it. And he felt that they all came away understanding his point of view. Now, whether or not that they're just going along with it in the interview and then they're saying, no way, or they're saying, okay, I totally believe him, that's up to each individual team. Over from then a couple other conversations I got were that they that some GMs or whatever were like, well, we're not going to question any of it. People got to do what they got to do best for them, and and they're worried about the pro element. They're not worried about the college element. And I think that it's going to kind of split into those camps for him going forward, which is there's going to be some teams that just take him off the board. He quit on his team. He could have played. When you get into December and January, everybody's hurt in the NFL, and we can't trust that player. Fair enough. Then there's going to be other teams that say, you know what? They were 6-4. He was hurting. He needed to do what was best for him. He'd already been there 6 years. He needed to get this fixed in order to put himself in this position. I get it. Okay. And then there's other teams that are like, I don't know. I don't really like it, but I understand it. And maybe we won't draft him in X position, but if he's at this position, we'll take him. So I think it's going to be kind of in that 3-tiered draft room process. So there'll probably be 10 teams that just say no, absolutely not. Maybe if he's a free agent, but even then, I don't know. Then there are other teams that say, yeah, sure, no problem. Character's not an issue for him. We like him. We have a lot of character flaws in this draft and in every draft, and what he has is not one of them. He's not hitting people. And then there's the other group that's like, well, they'll hash it out a little bit differently, and they'll have different perspectives within that draft war room, but all the meetings leading into that draft war room. So, so all it takes is one team to really like you, and I think he'll probably find that. So I think it wouldn't surprise me. Long-armed cornerback with extensive experience that's played well at a high level. Some team like Cincinnati, in the 4th round will say, yeah, he's our guy. We're all right with this. Maybe, and I'm just using that as an example. Or Detroit with Dan Campbell is like, hell no. We drafted a guy from Iowa. The guy played after knee surgery. This guy can't draft. And I'm just, again, I don't know what Detroit thinks, but I'm just saying that that's something that could be part of it.
Yeah, and every interaction, especially this season with Jamari, he was a fantastic quote for us consistently. Yeah. So I'm sure interviews with teams as well, that comes across. The other interesting thing with Jamari was that 37-inch vertical jump. That certainly doesn't hurt for a cornerback. Of course, it'd be nice, though, if he had a few other numbers. So pro day will be an interesting one for him, I feel like.
Yeah, he's going to have to run. I mean, and he chose not to run there, and I guess that helps him regarding whether, his injury status, his leg status or whatever, not to run, that he wants to give it a pro day. But how that works out for him, I don't know. And he's betting on himself. He's going to get an opportunity, and what he does with that opportunity, whether it's in the 4th round or the 6th round or even as an undrafted free agent, is all dependent upon himself now going forward. I think. But he got questioned about it. He said that's the first thing that people talked about, and he was pretty open because he knew he had to be. So, and he's had a couple other issues in his past too. He had an OWI when he was younger, and he's part of the gambling situation, which I think now is looked upon as a little less dire than it was a few years ago when that consumed our lives and theirs. So I think he's going to get drafted. I think he's going to get drafted in the 4th or 5th round. And, then it's up to him how he performs in camp as to whether or not he's a player. But yeah, I mean, a 37-inch vert is, for somebody like that. I mean, it's not Jalen Knoll from Iowa State's 41.5, but it's still pretty good.
And then a little bit of hoops talk before we wrap up. First of all, with Iowa women, obviously not playing through Sunday like how they have the previous few years, but I felt like they did enough to put themselves in a good position come Selection Sunday. And I don't think this is a team that people are going to want to play in March.
Of course not. The way they've played, I mean, you look at they've won what? Is it 9 out of 12? Is that the right number? Or 10 out of 13? Something like that, that they've won down the stretch. And they and those losses have all been, either in overtime or 2-point losses to highly ranked teams, and or 1-point loss the other day. And I think that there were some legitimate questioning of the foul disparity in the last minute of the game and against Ohio State. They've played really well. They're going to be a tough out. The teams are not going to look at that. And I think they've played themselves into a 6 seed. They're now like a 23 in the net, I think, as of this morning. And so I would expect them to go ahead and, be a 6 seed. And if you're a 3, you're going, why do we have them here? And because that's not the type of team you want to play. And, it's been kind of funny that, I think TCU is probably a 2 now, but the talk was, TCU is going to, Haley Van Lith is going to be eliminated by Iowa for the 3rd straight year by the 3rd different team, that she's been on. But if you're one of those teams getting a 3 seed and you're getting Iowa, that's going to cause you a lot of concern. Now, I'll say this, that they have to continue to improve and they're working on some things. I think it's been a really good year for Iowa women. I mean, to lose what they lost and I think people overlook that. Certainly they did here, maybe nationally, that you lose the winningest coach in Big Ten history, who's, like 4th, I think, 3rd or 4th in all-time basketball wins behind Bobby Knight and Tom Izzo. And I can't remember if she's 3rd with Gene Katie or not. And women's all-time leader there, the best player of all time, plus really key instrumental players like Kate Martin and Gabby Marshall and Molly Davis. And you bring in somebody and you bring in 5 freshmen, and then you have all these players who filled their roles, and now they have different roles, expansive roles. And there were a lot of issues, obviously, during the season. Then it became, then they were able to get it figured out and play really well over the last month and a half. And Lucy Olson has been fantastic, one of the best players in the country over that stretch. This is a tough out. I mean, it's not a team that you say, they have no chance to get the Sweet 16. They got a chance to get to the Sweet 16. And if they're a 3 and they're playing at 2, you've got to feel like they've got a puncher's chance. The way they beat USC, they almost beat UCLA. They're right there with Ohio State, their best friends, a couple of times. So, which I think that is their biggest rival personally, but, right now, because Ohio State feels hates them, absolutely hates them. So,
and did not hide it in the BTN post-game interview either. So
yeah, I've heard about this years going back that they felt that way. So, yeah, this is a team that's very much capable of reaching the second weekend and competing in that second weekend.
And then on the Iowa men's side, what could be an interesting offseason doesn't quite start yet after kind of holding on to beat Nebraska. I think that was a game that, Nebraska probably didn't play at the top of their game. They had some good shooters, missed some shots. They had, you look at Bryce Williams, somebody that Fran said, could be a player of the year candidate in conference, not play well at all. Iowa had a very good game plan against him and was not his best game either. But nonetheless, Iowa's in the tournament. They play a little longer, and we'll see. I don't think it's a very favorable matchup, speaking of Ohio State in the first round, but we'll see what happens this week in Indianapolis.
Yeah, it isn't a very good matchup for them, but Ohio State has been really up and down too. And one thing I think throughout this ordeal, and it's been significant for Iowa men through all the issues that they're facing and will face, is that they have played hard. And even if it hasn't been good, they've played hard. And, they led Michigan State for, 3/4 of the game the other day. They were able to, with Maryland, they were up on them and then blew it in the second half. Depth is not there. They've got, 3 to 4 players that are really good, and then the rest are guys. And I think, this isn't a great matchup, but you would have loved to have had him play a Rutgers or a Minnesota again or somebody like that. But, you play who you play. Last year they got mopped by Ohio State because they decided that 3-point defense isn't part of their game, and they just let them shoot open threes, and they made them all. But the thing though, you look at this though, and this is why there's so many different opinions, and they're not any of them, and most of them are right, or they're not wrong. They are 16-15 right now. Even in a bad year, they still have a winning record, and they're not going to, depending on what the postseason, which could be there because the Crown tournament and stuff. Right now, they're not having they can't have a losing season. If they go one and done, they're 500, and that's in the worst year you've had other than 2018 in the last almost 14 years or whatever. To only have a 500 season is not. A lot of teams have experienced worse than that in the Big Ten, who are better programs. So this is going to be a really interesting tournament.
Well, Scott, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. I always appreciate it.
And thanks to our listeners for tuning into another episode. Until next time, we will talk Hawks later.